Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is going to be our second installment to our 1980s history lecture series. Um, this time, we're going to take a particular focus on foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy during the Reagan years. As you can see from this image, I think it's safe to say that well, I don't know where you want to start. If you want to start with the invasion intervention of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in 1979, or you want to start with the election of Ronald Reagan, um, for all intents and purposes, the détente period had come to an end, and the Cold War started to heat up again. Okay, Brezhnev, uh, we had the Brezhnev Doctrine for the Soviets, meaning that no socialist revolution was reversible, and if there was threats to reverse it, it would be seen as a direct threat to USSR. And on the flip side, Ronald Reagan, ever the Cold Warrior, rededicated the United States to a re-embrace of both rollback and containment and direct confrontation against the Soviet Union. And it is a period that, once again, our fears of a nuclear war. The Cold War is heating up, and then there's always with it the possibility of the worst possible scenario. So those fears might have subsided in the late 60s and 70s. They're going to come back um, in the 80s, and both countries are going to become involved in the 1980s. At least for a time, and expanding their arsenals after so many years of actually reaching agreements like SALT 1 and SALT 2 in reducing these arsenals. But it is for a time, because there's many things that are about to happen. They're going to catch everybody by surprise. And as you could tell by those two images, it's safe to say by the 1980s, the entire world is the chessboard. All of the world has been sucked into the Cold War. It's in Africa. It's throughout Asia. It's in Latin America. Um, we're all, what started in 1945, 46 by the 1980s has already reached every corner of the earth. Um, and if we look at this image, just as, the United States uh, promoted the narrative that the Soviets, well, this period had great propaganda movies, by the way. The Soviets were out to conquer the world, okay? And the Soviets were in Africa and Cuba and Syria and meddling in the Gulf and Afghanistan and Thailand and Vietnam and China. On the flip side, although curiously, as far as what I understand, the Soviet media never, at least their films and TVs never went as far as we did. But they saw uh, themselves encircled by an enemy. Okay, um, and so they saw, U.S. involvement in Japan and China and Pakistan, Israel, Western Europe as a threat to the Soviet Union. So here we are in a bipolar world. Détente's been thrown out the window, and once again things are heating up again. And we're going to take this particular PowerPoint is not really going to be directly focused on the Soviet Union. It is going to take more of a, hey, the famous third world that was sucked into this. In the 1980s, what's going on? What's Reagan's role? In all of this. Well, this should be mentioned as an example of throwing détente out the window. Ronald Reagan in 1983, and this part and parcel. Remember I told you last PowerPoint, he doesn't have a problem with expanding, defense, because we're going back to an aggressive position. He actually asked Congress for money to set up a network of killer satellites in orbit that would shoot down any preemptive or even defensive response from the Soviet Union through the use of ICBMs and whatnot. And the hilarious thing is that at the time that he asked for this money, not only was it incredibly expensive, but the technology that he was asking for did not yet exist. And so they called it Star Wars, and the news made a big deal about calling it Star Wars. Um, here's a funny slide. We're not going to spend too much time on it. You'd always pause and, but the world according to Ronald Reagan. Okay, you look at that in your own. It's kind of funny. And we saw this map before. Is the world a better place now that the Cold War is entering its fourth decade? And what are the democracies left, for example, in Latin America? And what's all that olive green? Yeah, military dictatorships. Military dictatorships pretty much are the majority in Latin America, in Africa, and in post-colonial Africa as well. And the sad part is a lot of these military dictatorships emerge as a response to the Cold War. So let's first pay attention to Latin America. Cuba's the boogeyman here. Cuba's seen as, the promoter of communism in Latin America. Cuba itself acting as a middleman for the Soviet Union. Cuba's armed to the teeth. And we talked about Nicaragua, Cuba's role in inspiring and actually assisting the Sandinista revolution in 79. We saw Pinochet in 71 oust democratically elected President Allende. So let's go back to South America. Because if we look at South America in the 1970s, the sad story is all of those countries you see there um, were in the hands of military dictatorships, military juntas. And they legitimized and excused their existence by claiming that they were necessary in order to prevent their countries from becoming the next Cuba. And of course, the United States was very, very supportive of this endeavor. Operation Condor, which was made public many years later, was the cooperation between these governments, including the CIA, in basically putting together a program that would go after, if not leftist, perceived leftist, labor activists, any kinds of activists that perhaps ran a grain of the state. Doesn't matter, you were labeled a leftist. So a multinational campaign of state terrorism implemented by right-wing dictatorships that dominated South America from the 1950s to the 1980s. And heavily relying on U.S. support and assistance, which really ramped up during Nixon and would continue during Reagan. There you see Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, next to Videla, who was the military dictator of Argentina from 1976. I encourage you, there's a documentary on Netflix that talks about the Chilean experience. I forgot the name right now, so I shouldn't have even suggested that. The Argentine one is just as tragic and interesting. One of these things these guys used to like to do, and there's a deep connection to the United States. They would grab suspected subversives or what have you. And yes, these military dictatorships were known for kidnappings, disappearances, tortures, rapes. They would take the metal framework of a mattress and lies people on it and electrify the metal framework of the mattress, or grab subversives or supposed subversives, they believe subversives, and throw them out of airplanes into the ocean without a parachute. And in the end, they always legitimize this as a necessary evil. And we're going to talk about Argentina. Um, and there's a lot to say about this. I am going to post a video from this one channel on YouTube called Bad Empanada that he does a really good story, a really good version of the Argentine dictatorship, the dirty war in Argentina between 1976 and 1983, in which the military government of Argentina waged war on its own citizens. whether they truly were leftists or subversives or labor activists or perceived. Thousands of Argentinians disappeared between 76 and 83, never heard from again. Families that had children would disappear, and then the children would reappear many years later, having been adopted to members of this right-wing government. And why is this in an American history PowerPoint? Because the CIA supported these folks with intelligence, um, intelligence, even training, even financing throughout this entire period in South American history. Um, we haven't talked about it, but Brazil also had a military dictatorship. If you're interested, it's an older film, Kiss of the Spider Woman. That's a movie you might be interested in. And yet, it's in the 1980s when gives us the first instances of these dictatorships, um, the beginning of the end for these dictatorships. Long story short, Argentina for years has claimed that these islands off the coast of Argentina as Argentinian. They call them the Malvinas. But weirdly enough, the British claim those islands as the Falklands. The dictatorship in Argentina, already suffering from a lack of support, and a lot of people talk about in Cuba the ladies in white, La Dama, that actually comes from Argentine history. The women of La Plaza de Mayo, who would go out during the dictatorship to this plaza and hold up pictures of their missing children and beat on pots and pans. And so the military was dealing with a crisis of legitimacy. What better way to bolster public support for this military government that was losing it than to appeal to nationalism? Let's go to war and claim the Malvinas as Argentine, even if it means challenging the British. And they took a funny gamble. I don't know if you guys remember the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe says, any European country uh, hoping to establish or reestablish a colony in the Americas would be seen as an act of war against the United States. And so, these right-wing Argentine, generals and colonels had a great relationship with the U.S., and they thought the U.S. would have their back against Britain. And Britain sent a force to protect the Falklands. The Argentines went, made a landing in the Falklands or Malvinas, whatever you call it. The British sent the force. The Argentines didn't think the Americans were gonna co-op. Well, you know what the Reagan administration did? Refueled the British force and let it continue on very far distance to Argentina. And the British soundly beat the Argentine. It was sad because they're drafting young guys that have nothing to do with that. But Argentina suffered a substantial military defeat in their half-baked attempt to rebolster support for that military government. And the military's defeat would lead to the collapse of that government and the reemergence of democratically elected civilian government in Argentina. So that's a silver lining. Yes, Britain came. It's kind of crazy. Britain would claim these islands so far away. But the silver lining of Argentina's, loss was the beginning of the end for Vidala's government. Let's talk about the Cold War in Africa. Decolonization since the 1950s had been going on, and the pattern that began to be established was that the U.S. gave somewhere between no to very cautious, lukewarm support to movements of national liberation and independence. In other words, siding with European colonizers. And the Soviets moved in and filled that vacuum. So, well, if the U.S. is going to be on the side of the former colonizers and the Soviet Union is going to support all movements for independence and decolonization in Africa. And that is how the Cold War eventually, emerged in Africa. Um, yeah, and that's how, it centered around that. So whether it's the, Algeria veering to the left, or well, Egypt's a different story, or the Congo, at first kicking out the Belgians, at first drifting towards the left until the CIA got in there and had Lumumba killed and replaced with Mobutu Sese Seko in the country of Zaire, a right-wing dictatorship. The one let's pay attention to in the 80s, though, is South Africa, all the way in the southern tip there of Africa. And South Africa was allied with NATO, and as was Rhodesia. Um, and then up there, well, the country between South Africa and Angola is Namibia. And Namibia was under South African administration since World War I. And you know that South Africa was a white government, even though the population was majority black, and they practiced apartheid just like the Rhodesians. And so what the hell is this picture of Fidel Castro doing there? Fidel Castro, let's just say Cuba, had a very ambitious, outsized foreign policy for a small island of, at the time, imagine 10, 11 million people. She was armed to the teeth by the Soviet Union, not as successful at promoting revolution in Latin America, with very few successes, namely Nicaragua, but more successful in Africa. And Cuba had been sending, this is a different period. This is a period which Cuba had a very active foreign policy. Cuba actually would deploy troops all over the world. Cubans deployed troops to Syria during the Yom Kippur War. There were Cuban bases in Yemen, in Ethiopia. Che in the mid 60s went to the Congo to support Lumumba supporters. But in the 80s, we're looking at Angola. Now, Angola and Mozambique used to be Portuguese colonies. There was a change of government, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, getting rid of the fascist dictator Salazar, and that led to the immediate call for the decolonization by Portugal of Africa, and that means the independence of Angola and Mozambique. Angola and Mozambique, soon after independence, would shift towards the left and open their doors to support from the Soviet Union. But the country to their south, South Africa, was not very happy, not very comfortable with having a leftist government to the north in Angola. So they funded an insurgent slash terrorist group called UNITA. The effort of crossing the border and destabilizing the Angolan government. So, what is the role of Cuba in this? We'll get back to that in a second. Okay? We'll get back to Angola in a second. Africa also has other experiences in the 1980s. For example, from Mozambique, um, the movement to free Rhodesia from white minority rule. Okay, and that was a guerrilla campaign led by Mr. Robert Mugabe, who ends up being the dictator. Um, they renamed Rhodesia. I forgot what they renamed Rhodesia right now. It's not Mozambique. I forgot what they renamed, but that's kind of embarrassing. Um, with a lot of support from Cuba, training from support. Cuba just poured men and resources into Africa. Cuba was able to achieve a kind of military success in Africa that she never did in Latin America. Um, into the 80s, you also have Upper Volta, After a coup saw the emergence of Thomas Sankara, who's often called the Che of Africa. He implemented a number of reforms: education, healthcare, women's rights. He renamed the country Burkina Faso, pulled it out of the World Bank and the IMF. Um, he, however, will be assassinated by somebody in his country that would return Burkina Faso to the Western fold in 1987. But let's go back to, oh, wait a minute. Let's not forget South Africa was in the middle of a ongoing um, struggle to end apartheid. And if you don't know what apartheid was, think of it as a mixture of segregation and the reservation policy that we did to Native Americans. The whites of South Africa are not the native indigenous populations of Africa. These are the descendants of Dutch and British colonists who came and imposed their will and created a state on land which was not theirs. Um, and what they did was, instead of reservations, much like the American reservation, they set up communities called townships, and that's where the African population would live. The South African population would live, and everything was separate. And so, long story short, they came and took our land, and then they separated us into these little groups. Probably one of the most well-known freedom fighters of South Africa was, I imagine you could recognize him from his picture, Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison throughout the 60s and 70s and well into the 80s. The man spent like 20-something islands, 20-something years on Robben Island. Keep your eye on South Africa. It becomes important in how the Cold War plays out um, in Africa. And you can guess it. If the U.S. supports maintaining the white government of South Africa, um, the Soviet Union supports the end of apartheid and the liberation of black people in South Africa. And yeah, Ethiopia, they kicked out Haile Selassie. Um, it's one of these rare cases in which the military itself was leftist, pulled a coup, and took control of the country and started implementing reforms that would model Ethiopia along a Soviet socialist-like government. And again, support from Cuba. But they got sucked into a war with their neighbors. So yes, there's no shortage of countries in Africa, particularly countries that are either fighting apartheid or fighting or trying to decolonize that are going to drift into the Cold War. So us go back to the conversation. Some of you might even have parents that know about this. Of Angola between 1975 and 1988. So Angola is freed of Portuguese colonial rule. Um, Wants to go to the left and form a socialist government. South Africa to the south doesn't want that, so they fund an organization, UNITA, with the hope of toppling this government, attacking inside Angola. So Angola, Agustin Neto was the president of Angola, reaches out to his allies for help. And the country that dedicates itself to, Vietnam was America's Vietnam, and Angola was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Angola was Cuba's Vietnam. Okay, this island nation on the other side of the ocean in the Caribbean, of no more than 9-10 million people at the time, is going to pour treasure which it doesn't have into Angola to prop up the government of Angola at the invitation of NATO and the government of Angola. The Cuban military went to Angola with the idea of propping up and defending the government of the MPLA, which was the ruling socialist government of Angola, against incursions by UNITA. As soon as the Cubans show up, um, the stakes increase. South African army starts to make incursions into Namibia. They have the right to, because under the UN, Namibia is under South African administration, and then this becomes the African Bush War or the Border War, in which basically Angolan and Cuban troops are fighting a very deadly border war um, against UNITA and actual South African army. There's a lot of interesting stories about this. In fact, South Africa is the only country in the history of the world to develop a nuclear weapon and then dismantle it and get rid of it. And you may ask yourselves, why was Angola inventing a nuclear weapon? Remember, Angola had their neighbor to the north, Rhodesia, which was another white apartheid government. And the fact was that uh, black liberation movements were succeeding. That nuclear weapon was for a worst case scenario. If the blacks win, if the Cubans and the Angolans pour over the border and head for South Africa, that's what that nuclear weapon was for. Okay? It never came to that. The worst that it came to was the actual South African army actually crossed the border into Angola, um, and they were met by the Cuban military there in Angola at the famous battle of Cuito Cuanavale. And Cuito Cuanavale was pretty much a defeat for South Africa. Okay, and depends on who you talk to, and people have different opinions. But long story short, the Cuban presence in Angola um, delivered a decisive defeat to South Africa, forced South Africa to the negotiating table. And in the end, in 1988, uh, South Africa agreed to stop funding UNITA and withdraw from Namibia. In exchange, Cuba agreed to withdraw its troops from Angola. And the end result would be the independence of Namibia. So, I don't know how your parents will deal with this, but in Namibia, Fidel Castro is kind of seen as one of the founding fathers of that country, since it was Cuba's military role in Angola that eventually led South Africa to negotiate and withdraw its troops from Namibia. Not only that, but the narrative is this was the beginning of the end of the apartheid government in South Africa. And many trace the beginning of the end of the apartheid government to South Africa to Cuba's involvement in the war in South Africa. Had it not been for Cuba's involvement defending Angola and scoring several victories against the South African government, which led to cracks in that government and its eventual downfall, the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, and the end of apartheid South Africa and a new democratic multiracial South Africa after the fact. So yes, unpopular opinion here in Miami, but in South Africa, Cuba and Fidel Castro are highly revered, both for the independence of Namibia, the liberation of Rhodesia, and the end of the apartheid government in South Africa. Let's go back to Central America. And we talked about the Sandinista War um, in the 1970s. And Ronald Reagan just cannot live with the fact of another country in Latin America going the route of Nicaragua. Nicaragua implements all these reforms, you know, literacy, healthcare, the elimination of polio, the elimination of measles, etc., etc. Um, but they're not going to last very long. They're not going to last very long because Nicaragua is going to have a war thrust upon it. It's going to have a war thrust upon it that starts in 1980. That was organized by, not entirely, but by former National Guardsmen using Honduras as a base of operations to launch incursions into Nicaragua with the idea of destabilizing and removing the Sandinista government. There was also another faction of the Contras. They called themselves Contras because they were contra-revolucionarios, counter-revolutionaries. Um, it's complicated because many of them, There was one faction, the main faction, that these represented the Nicaraguan right that had been defeated in the Sandinista Revolution. A lot of them former National Guardsmen. But there was also other factions. Okay, for example, some of them were disaffected Sandinistas themselves. Eden Pastora, which was one of the Sandinistas that took over, held the Nicaraguan Congress hostage, actually left the Sandinistas, um, and he was responsible for that southern faction that would come out of Costa Rica and launch incursions against the Nicaraguans. So in the north, your former National Guard Colonel Enrique Bermudez uh, launching incursions across Rio Coco from Honduras. You have Eden Pastora, who was not necessarily a right winger. He was you see him today. He still has a picture of Che Guevara in his office. He had felt as a former Sandinista that Sandinitas had lost their way. And then you also have marginalized people in Nicaraguan society, particularly coming out of the Caribbean coast. The indigenous population of Nicaragua, the largest being the Miskito natives, who turned against the Sandinista government because the Sandinista government was um, taking and redistributing lands that they felt were ancestral indigenous lands. So you have this interesting coalition, of groups that had an issue with the Sandinista government, but they never succeeded in launching an offensive into where most Nicaraguans live, which is the Pacific coast. They had the full support of Reagan. And this is a rabbit hole story that, I better hurry up. But they had the full support of Reagan. Reagan cast them as freedom fighters. He claimed that what happened in Nicaragua was a red reign of terror, and these were men trying to rescue Nicaragua from that. When these Contras were responsible for pretty horrendous human rights abuses throughout this entire war. Um, this war is going to lead eventually to the deaths of 30,000 Nicaraguans. So a little fun fact you may not hear. So the Sandinitas win in 79. In 84, there's an election. Okay, and as soon as the Sandinitas win, the United States starts to tighten the screws. Okay, it denies Nicaragua access to any type of finance from American banks, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Already the economy starts to feel the squeeze. And now they have to pour all these resources into fighting a two-front war. The Sandinitas, of course, their popularity is declining because now they have to draft people to fight this war and spend resources on this war instead of all these reforms they wanted to do. And this was deliberate. Um, in order to appease the United States, Nicaragua has an election in 1984, I believe. International observers say the election was fair. There was no problem with it. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas win like almost 70% of the vote. Despite international organizations claiming there was a free and open and democratic election, Ronald Reagan said it was a sham. He wasn't going to accept it. And as a gift, as a congratulations gift to the Sandinistas for winning a democratic election in '84, he imposed a trade embargo on Nicaragua. I mean, this is the bag of tricks. This is what you do. You make a system like this. You rig the system like this to fail by imposing sanctions, by imposing trade embargoes, by restricting access to trade, by restricting access to outside, to finance, to capital, et cetera, et cetera. Of course. And then, you throw a war at them to spend even more resources in that direction. But the Sandinitas win the election of '84. Okay. There's going to be another election in '90, which the Sandinitas are going to lose. Okay. So the Sandinitas actually have that to their credit. They took power in the revolution. They put themselves up for an election in '84. They won, despite the U.S. saying they lost. I guess early Venezuela could make the same claim. Another election in 1990, they lose and they step down without any problem. Okay, and they stepped down without any problem, and there went Nicaragua's literacy rate and stuff like that. Um, a little bit more in Central America. Oh, and Reagan supported him wholeheartedly, and of course, a lot of them came to Miami. So let's not fool ourselves. The foundation of the Nicaraguan community here in Miami were folks that, for the most part, were anti-Sandinitas, were pro-Contras, supportive of either supportive of the government before, and sometimes just simply uh, couldn't support the Sandinitas for other reasons. Okay, namely, they left Nicaragua to not have their kids be drafted into this war. Reagan tried to get funding from the United States to directly see a lot of the support that Contras got from the U.S. was not direct support. A lot of that money was not, the military support was not direct support. And we're going to talk about that later. Um, Reagan tried to get direct support from Congress, and Congress said no. The CIA tried to mine the I think it was the harbor of Managua. The CIA said no, so Reagan had to find other ways of funding the Contras. And yes, during the war, um, it's funny, the Contras received a lot of help from members of the Argentine military government. On the flip side, the Sandinitas received a lot of military assistance from the Cuban military as well. So there was a proxy element to it. Next door in El Salvador, um, there was a coup in '79. The military took over. Why? The excuse: we got Nicaragua to the south. We got Cuba still trying to promote revolutions. We have no choice. We have to do this, or El Salvador will end up like another Cuba, actually worse. Um, and then the military takes over, and they give carte blanche to right-wing paramilitary organizations. Um, and essentially, they begin to terrorize subversives, revolutionaries, and perceived ones as well. The perception was, well, the Salvadoran version of the Sandinista was the Frente Farabundo Martí Liberación Nacional. So Farabundo Martí, which was a Sandinista, a Sandino-like figure in Salvadoran history. And the military became quite repressive against who they saw as the enemy and the perceived enemy, namely the country's poor and peasant indigenous population. And this would only further fuel and bring people into the leftist resistance, the Farabundo Martí, um, until Salvador was, they tried to follow the Nicaraguan model, but they ended up with a civil war in El Salvador that created incredible hardship and bloodshed and tragedy in that country. The world started paying attention to what was happening in El Salvador when Archbishop Oscar Romero, he wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter asking him to stop funding the military government because the military government was using that money to terrorize and repress, for the most part, the poor and working class of El Salvador. That letter was made public. The military government found out about this letter. Um, Archbishop Oscar Romero was giving Mass on March 24th. Well, I think it was an earlier Mass that he made, that he asked members of the military to search their conscience, that what they were doing was wrong, because there were horrendous human rights abuses, and to disobey their officers if they felt what they were doing was wrong. To disobey their officers, do not kill their fellow Salvadorans. Well, on March 24th, 1980, in the middle of Mass, a Salvadoran death squad walked into the church and killed the Archbishop as he was giving Mass. And this brought the attention of the world, and the U.S. could no longer, as easily as they did before, this is the beginning of Reagan's administration, support the right-wing military government, but they did. Okay, Nicaragua would support the FMLN. Um, the U.S. would support the military government of El Salvador, and this war is going to last for like 12 years. This is not a huge country. This is going to take the life of 75,000 people. 96% of the human rights abuses committed by the government's military death squads. Many of those, and there's ties till today. Many of the problems that Central America has today with gangs and criminal organizations, they could trace their lineage all the way back to the death squads and the military dictatorships going back to the 1960s. And that many of these guys were trained in Fort Benning, Georgia, at a place called the United States Army, the School of the Americas. At the School of the Americas, they were taught counterinsurgency. And they found these manuals, they've discovered them. U.S. Army personnel was teaching military personnel from throughout Latin America on how to deal with left-wing insurgencies, and it also gave them step-to-step instructions on interrogation and in torture, um, and basically how to terrorize the population. And these guys went home and did that. Reagan liked to talk really tough, particularly about the role of the military. So let's look at one of the instances in which the U.S. actually actively evolved itself militarily um, during Reagan's presidency. And that brings us to the teeny tiny island in the Lesser Antilles of Grenada. Okay? One of the tiny little islands in that lower chain of islands in the Caribbean. The country of Grenada, in which the only future you had there was either leaving that country to find work elsewhere or working in the tourism industry. They had a change of government, and they elected a man named Maurice Bishop, who believed that he wanted more for his country. He wanted Grenadans to aspire to be more than just bartenders and busboys and housekeeping at a hotel. Maurice Bishop made the mistake of getting very friendly with Cuba and the Cuban government and Fidel Castro. They had planned to build an airport with Cuban assistance that would draw in more tourists and by that way more capital into Grenada. Um, in 1983, there was a coup. The military launched a coup, which assassinated Maurice Bishop. This particular coup was not necessarily, it was other communists in there. Long story short, the Reagan administration used this as an excuse. Oh my God, they assassinated, we didn't like it to begin with, but they assassinated the president of Grenada. There's instability in that island. God knows what's going to happen. There's a medical school on the island, and we need to go rescue those medical students, even though there was never any sign or any message from them saying that they needed rescuing. They were perfectly fine. And so Reagan gets, and this is important because the U.S. was dealing military with a crisis of confidence since Vietnam. And this was an opportunity to show America we're back militarily. And so uh, Marines and the U.S. Army launch an operation, Operation Urgent Fury, to free Grenada from a pro-Cuba, now military government who endangers the lives of these medical students who weren't in danger, and to keep this island from becoming another Cuba. And the bulk of that invasion force focused on that airport in that south coast of, and so the narrative was it, yeah, the Marines came and freed Grenada from communist rule and Cuban troops. There were no Cuban troops in Grenada. They were Cuban construction workers, except in Cuba they refer to them as Brigada de Construcción, construction brigades. So it's a military terminology. So at the end of the story, yes, Marines and Army came in, fought against the Grenadian military and Cuban construction workers, okay, and basically a regime change, okay. Cuba withdrew, and Grenada had to change its government, and that was the great military victory that Ronald Reagan won, and the students that didn't need to be rescued were rescued, and that is Operation Urgent Fury. Now let's go to the Middle East. We could do this about an hour. It's a 15-minute. Let's go to the Middle East. Iraq. Now we know in 1979 Iran had a revolution which destabilized the Middle East. The West didn't like it because now, it's not a country that we safely have in our pocket that we could tell what to do, and now we're afraid because the Soviets are, right across the northern border. So let's back up somebody that's going to keep Iran in check. That brings us to Iraq. You should know a lot about Iraq. Iraq is featured prominently in our recent history. Iraq at the time was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who, I don't know if you know this, was a CIA agent. He was the guy that was behind the last coup, because the last coup was becoming too friendly with the Soviets through Nasser, and they put Saddam Hussein in there precisely because Saddam Hussein had a more pro-U.S. angle than his predecessors. So he's a CIA asset, absolutely. If we could convince Saddam Hussein to launch a war against Iran, we could destabilize Iran and possibly, if everything works out well, change that regime in Iran. And that gives us the Iran-Iraq war that lasted for 8 years. Okay? And the world never thought they were going to see a repeat of a war that looks like World War I, but this one, it looked exactly like World War I. Okay? There was an intent to invade. It was stopped after a certain distance, and what you have there is trench warfare for the next 8 years. And here's pictures of soldiers in the trenches. And, the two people we have to look at is Saddam Hussein and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Iran is Shia. Iraq is, don't be so sure. Iraq was ruled by the Sunnis, but there was plenty of Shia to the south of Iraq and plenty of Kurds to the north of Iraq. And there's a little interesting picture there in the corner. That is Saddam Hussein shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld. Okay? So U.S. was very much on the side of Saddam. It's funny, U.S. was supporting Saddam militarily during this war. There's a lot of criticism about Saddam using poison gas on Iranian troops. And we didn't have a problem. Whenever you hear about, Saddam Hussein gassing people, we don't have a problem with him gassing the Iranians. Okay? U.S. AWAC aircraft, high altitude reconnaissance, was actually flying over, the border between Iraq and Afghanistan, giving the Iraqi Air Force coordinates where they should drop their chemical weapons attacks against the Iranians. Okay. In the end, the war lasted almost 8 years, killed over 1 million Iraqis and Iranians, civilians included, cost almost $1 trillion combined, and ended up in a stalemate with neither side accomplishing their objectives, weakened and both hardened Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously. October 23rd, 1983, as the Iraq-Afghanistan war is playing out, Iraq is getting a lot of weapons from the United States. Iran is not, right? Iran is the enemy of the United States. Stay tuned, kids. Things get interesting. Beirut's in the middle of a civil war. There's a ceasefire. U.S. agrees to send Marines to Beirut as a sort of peacekeeping force. Then something happens. Hezbollah, which is a Shia Islamist group that is sponsored by Iran but operates out of Lebanon, blew up those barracks, killed 241 U.S. Marines. I don't know what another president would do, but what did Ronald Reagan do? Tough guy Ronald Reagan decided to take what was left and withdraw from Lebanon. So we did not pursue any sort of revenge for the bombing that killed 241 Marines. And of course, the Iranians did that for our support of Iraq, and they did it through Hezbollah. We're not done with Hezbollah. Between 1982 and 1992, Hezbollah successfully kidnapped, either by hijacking planes, that was a common way, kidnapped 96 foreign hostages, most of them American and Western European, as a means of applying some leverage on the United States and getting them to stop their support for both Israel and for Iraq. Okay? Iraq is the Iraq-Iran war, and Israel simply because of the presence of Israel and the role of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I want you to remember this. Okay? Starting in 1982 and for the next 10 years, Hezbollah is going to be able to get their hands on a number of Americans and hold them hostages. The story's going to get good. So, how exactly did Ronald Reagan find the money that Congress denied to him to militarily support the Contras? And this is going to say a little bit about who the Contras really were, what kind of people they were, or how far they were willing to go. This brings us to the Iran-Contra scandal of 1986. You got Oliver North, and you have Southern Air Command, etc., etc. You have John Kerry, you have a Contra fighter. So, this might surprise people, but this was proven true. Congress held hearings. The Tower Commission looked into it and agreed with the findings. People went to jail. Reagan may believe that he had Alzheimer's, okay, that he had no idea. How do I get money to support Contras even though Congress told me that I shouldn't? Well, let's go to Iran. Hezbollah, working for Iran, had captured a number of American hostages. Can we make a deal with, so that's what the Tower Commission. Reagan arranged for the sale of surplus anti-tank missiles, the ones from the last slide, to Iran in exchange for the release of those hostages. There's two income streams. There's two income streams that are going to end up funding the Contras. Income stream number one, the selling of anti-tank weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages. And despite Reagan denying that he had anything to do with that, yes. Even though there was a trading with the enemy, even though trading with Iran was bought, we were doing it through Israel. Okay? We were handing out the missiles to Israel. Israel was giving them to Iran. Okay? And then Iran, little by little, was letting go of the hostages. So that's income stream number one. Income stream number two takes us to Colombia, takes us to the cartels, takes us to people like Pablo Escobar. Okay? They had a particular interest. The U.S. is their market. Okay? And they would like to make it easier to bring their product into the United States. But of course, that's not easy bringing illegal drugs into the United States unless, of course, there was an arrangement in which the authorities might look the other way. And the cartels were willing to reward whoever would do this. So long story short, the CIA enters into a partnership with some of the most powerful drug cartels in Colombia. If you help us get our product into the United States, okay, we'll pay you. Okay. And that was money that the CIA would not turn away because, after all, the CIA under Reagan was looking for money precisely to fund the Contras in their war against the Sandinistas. So, income stream number two, the CIA ran a phony airline. Okay, they did this in Vietnam called Southern Air Transport. I've seen that plane before. They parked it well into the early 90s, right off here in Miami International. It might have said Southern Air Transport. It was a CIA air cargo company. And since nobody's going to stop a CIA plane, uh, Southern Air Transport would fly to Colombia, load the planes full of drugs, cocaine, and then fly into the United States, no questions asked, where that product was put into hands of people waiting there to sell and distribute into the streets of the United States, fueling not just the proliferation of cocaine in the United States, but also fueling the crack epidemic. Okay? Now, we just can't directly hand the money to the CIA. That's going to look awful. So the money that the cartels agreed to pay the CIA instead would be deposited in banks in Panama. Panama was kind of like a Switzerland, ruled by Manuel Noriega, that basically has a no questions asked banking policy. Anybody could deposit money into one of their banks, no questions asked, and anybody could withdraw money from those banks, no questions asked. The only people that really knew, okay, were the most important people in the country. For example, Manuel Noriega, who was a CIA asset for years and knew exactly what was happening. So CIA planes fly to Colombia, load with drugs, fly them to the United States. The cartels pay the CIA by depositing that money in Panamanian banks. Representatives from the Contras could therefore go to those Panamanian banks, withdraw that money, and use it to purchase weapons in their war against the Sandinistas. So the Contras were being funded by illegal arms sales to Iran, who was technically an enemy of the United States. And it's funny because we were arming both Iraq and Iran, and also funded through drug money, as facilitated by the CIA in their transport of drugs into the United States on behalf of the Colombian cartels, okay, and that money being funneled into Panama to be used by um, the Contras. And so the Contras had no problem funding their struggle through drug money. That says a lot about that organization. The journalist that uncovered the truth about this connection between the drug cartels, the CIA, Panamanian banks. Um, his name was Gary Webb. I know it's too small for you to see the text there. He's the one that broke the story out of a San Diego newspaper. With not very long after that, Mr. Gary Webb would commit suicide with 2 bullet holes in the back of his skull. It's not the first and not the last time that somebody in this country, after being a whistleblower and disclosing information that powerful people would rather not be disclosed, ends up committing suicide by shooting themselves in the back of the head. This is all the Iran-Contra scandal. The Reagan administration was caught uh, committing a crime, selling illegal arms to a country that was an enemy of the United States, involved in drug trafficking to funnel those profits um, that would eventually be used to purchase arms for an organization that was being used to oust, to unseat and oust the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. All right, so I'm going to post a bunch of other stuff with this. We already went into the hour. And that's pretty much the third world, Reagan, U.S. foreign policy. We covered Latin America, we covered Africa, we covered the Middle East. Maybe not with the great depth that I would like to, but enough for a quiz. I'm going to post some other videos to add more depth to our discussion today. There's only one video left. I'm going to post it in a couple of days, and that is going to be the fall of the Soviet Union. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this one and learned something.